This angel is named Dan, who usually travels across the world of the living, guiding souls to heaven. Unlike the harshness of other gods, Dan is full of compassion for the world. He not only frequently uses his powers to save small animals, but also brings punishment to wrongdoers. At midnight tomorrow, Dan will abandon his duty of guiding souls in the human world to ascend to heaven. But before that, he has one final task to complete. As soon as Dan receives the mission address, he's distracted by a commotion nearby. It turns out that two thugs are bullying a blind girl. But the girl does not seem easily intimidated. She raised her guiding cane. With just a few hits, she knocked over the gang of thugs. Although she was not weak in morale, the insults from the thugs still deeply saddened the blind girl. This girl's name was Yono. She was the signorina of a conglomerate. Despite being born into a wealthy family, fate had not favored her. After the sudden death of her parents, Yono, who was originally the captain of a ballet group, was injured by a falling chandelier during a performance leading to blindness. This caused her career to stall. Her vast fortune fell into the hands of her relatives. Yono was disappointed and always looking for a chance to receive a corneal transplant, but miraculously each time there was a donor, they would back out for various reasons. Yono remained stuck between hope and waiting, leading to her increasingly extreme and irritable temperament. Dan was strongly attracted by Yono's resilience. He followed Yono to the bridge. Yono remembered her lost ballet career, feeling immense sorrow. Dan, is out of kindness, originate from empathy, slowly approached Yono, using his transparent body to place an angelic kiss on her lips. Suddenly, all the sadness in Yono's heart disappeared, turning into a shower of flowers that slowly fell. Yono returned to the park bench, feeling the sensation of the flower rain. It seemed that because of this kiss, that although she could not see, Yono could feel Dan's presence, which greatly surprised Dan, because until now, humans have not been able to see his state in the human world. Perhaps just now, that having been harassed by two thugs, Yono became very sensitive to the man sitting next to her. She asked Dan to leave the seat. Dan, who facing with Yono's badass attitude, started to argue, saying that everything in the world belongs to God. Yono has no right to deprive others of their rights, but Yono showed contempt for God. Seeing Yono's extremism, Dan told her, "Not everyone who experiences tragedy becomes as negative as she is, and not everyone wants to jump off a bridge." Hearing the other person mention her past, Yono's eyes widened. She hurriedly approached to ask Dan's identity. In the midst of pushing and shoving, the handkerchief on Dan's chest fell, picked up by Yono. Meanwhile, the aunt on the other side firmly decided to celebrate the company's 20th anniversary on the death anniversary of Yono's parents, not only inviting a large number of guests, but also arranging a ballet troupe to perform. After Yono retired, her daughter Nina became the principal dancer of the ballet troupe. In any way you look at it, this arrangement was a provocation against Yono. Secretary Cho was responsible for taking care of Yono, went to her aunt, announcing that Yono would attend the party that day, but her aunt claimed credit, saying that after Yono lost her vision, it was fortunate that she stepped up to lead the ballet troupe. Therefore, she wanted Yono to witness the troupe's current glory. But Secretary Cho shattered her aunt's selfishness with one sentence. Yono's misfortune was her aunt's blessing. If Yono regained her sight and returned to take over the ballet troupe, in that case, the aunt would be immediately thrown out. Additionally, Yono's corneal transplant surgery faced obstacles. Secretary Cho suspected that it was due to the aunt's tricks. Before leaving, he said he would investigate this matter thoroughly. The aunt began to panic. It was true that she had bribed the doctor, constantly obstructing Yono's transplant surgery so that she could always remain secure in the position of the troupe leader and then promote her own daughter. Afterward, she went to the doctor, repeatedly warning him to keep everything secret. Otherwise, when the time came, she would make the doctor the scapegoat. That night, Dan accidentally discovered that the handkerchief on his chest had gone missing. This was the only path for an angel to reach heaven. With it, he could pass through the gates of heaven the next day. Dan anxiously began searching around. He suddenly remembered perhaps the blind girl had held it. At this moment, Yono was awakened by a nightmare. Secretary Cho immediately came to comfort her, since her parents passed away. Secretary Cho had always cared for and looked after Yono. He knew Yono's pain and anger, but still encouraged her, hoping to see Yono's cheerful smile. But in Yono's eyes, these words became twisted, all extremely harsh. The next day, Yono suddenly changed her previous attitude, dressed up to attend the company's anniversary celebration. This was the first time Yono appeared in public since losing her sight, attracting the attention of all the guests present. During the ballet performance, Yono did not appear in the audience, but went to the deserted hallway of the company. She locked the door, took Dan's handkerchief, twisted it into a ballet dancer's headband, then placed it on the ground beside her. Be her companion in this desolate place. She danced to the music in the performance room. At the party afterward, Yono took the stage to give a speech. The aunt had hoped that she could use her disability, thereby securing some sponsors sponsorships for the troupe. Yeon-seo mocked Nina mercilessly, which made her aunt extremely angry. Yeon-seo said these words to take revenge because her aunt organized the celebration on the anniversary of her parents' death. And Dan also came to the celebration to retrieve the handkerchief. While Yeon-seo was dancing, Dan recovered the handkerchief, and he was also the only audience for Yeon-seo. Seeing Yeon-seo and Secretary Cho leave, the sunset gradually faded. Dan headed to the final task location to welcome the departed soul. The last person he needed to welcome was Secretary Cho. It turned out that Secretary Cho's car had been played dirty tricks by someone else, causing it to lose control on a mountain road. When Dan arrived, the entire car was stuck at the edge of a cliff. Yeon-seo was still alive and sensed Dan's presence and cried out for his help. In the end, Dan could not bear it, and at the moment the car was about to fall, he stopped time, revealed his true form as an angel, and flew to the car to save Yeon-seo and bring the car back to the highway. Soon Yeon-seo was discovered by Kang-woo, who happened to pass by and took her to the hospital, where Secretary Cho's corneal transplant was performed on her. Although Yeon-seo was saved, Dan's mistaken belief caused him to commit a grave error. Senior angels had previously warned him. One of the prohibitions for angels is to intervene in human life and death. Now Dan had saved someone who was compelled to die, that was Yeon-seo. According to the punishment, his soul would be dispersed. Just as Dan closed his eyes waiting for judgment, but nothing happened. It turned out that the souls Dan had helped before had pleaded for his mercy. Therefore, heaven was willing to give him another chance to live as a human for 100 days and help a girl find love. If he succeeded, the gates of heaven would be reopened to him. The girl in question was Yeon-seo. After waking up in the hospital, Yeon-seo regained her sight, but upon learning of Secretary Cho's death, she didn't care about her health and went to the funeral. Yeon-seo stood before Secretary Cho's photo, recalling the words he had once said to her. He hoped to see Yeon-seo's bright smile, so Yeon-seo showed a forced smile. But this smile made those present at the funeral think that Yeon-seo might be crazy. That night, when Yeon-seo returned home and looked for Secretary Cho's tape to watch, her repressed tears finally flowed. Even Secretary Cho, who had always cared for her, also had left her. Even if he had left Yeon-seo his eyes, what use was that? Yeon-seo in pain lay on the floor and slept all night. When she woke up early in the morning, she found that her feet could not walk. After the doctor came to examine her, said it was a psychological condition related to the loss of a loved one. Due to excessive grief, it led to an inability to perform actions related to the deceased in the past. This put Yeon-seo and the butler in a difficult situation because nearly all of Secretary Cho's daily work was with Yeon-seo. Therefore, after Yeon-seo was able to see everything, her limbs became paralyzed. Since Secretary Cho had passed away, the butler needed to hire a new secretary. Yeon-seo, being picky, and rejected all the candidates who were interviewed. Dan, who wanting to approach Yeon-seo, also attended the interview and was inadvertently rejected. However, before leaving, Dan criticized Yeon-seo's attitude and advised her to be someone who was both radiant and friendly. Yeon-seo was angry and stood up and chased after him. At that moment, the butler was astonished and shouted in surprise because Dan's appearance allowed Yeon-seo to walk again. Seeing this, the butler called Dan back and hired him as the new secretary. Over the following time as they were together, Dan discovered that Yeon-seo was indeed a cold and indifferent person, an extremely hypercritical girl. She carefully checked every nook and cranny of the house, not allowing a single speck of dust or a hair to remain. Dan, feeling somewhat desperate, realized that making Yeon-seo, who was so picky, fall in love would not be easy at all. But Dan would not give up. Time passed day by day. Yeon-seo lectured the maids all day long for not doing their jobs properly. Dan couldn't stand it, so he stepped in for the maids, was punished by Yeon-seo to sweep the fallen petals in the yard when it rained heavily at night. Dan's angel wings suddenly grew. What was even more coincidental was that Yeon-seo's calling signal in Dan's pocket also rang at this time. According to Yeon-seo's rules, after receiving the signal, Dan had to appear in front of her as soon as possible. But at this time, Dan was carrying the wings, obviously not allowed to let Yeon-seo see. Searching for Dan failed, so Yeon-seo started walking towards his room. Dan went everywhere to hide, holding the doorknob to prevent Yeon-seo from entering the room. Suddenly, the glass door in the living room broke. Yeon-seo heard the noise and left. Shards of glass scattered all over the floor, reminding her of the chandelier that fell on stage. Yeon-seo sat on the ground in fear. At this time, the wind blew into the house through the broken windows, causing the chandelier in the house to sway. The scene was similar. Just like that, Yeon-seo temporarily lost the ability to think. Her whole body was covered in fear. Suddenly, the chandelier made a breaking sound, falling from above Yeon-seo's head. At the moment of a hair's breadth, Dan brought his wings and appeared above Yeon-seo, blocking the falling chandelier for her. Under his feet were broken pieces of glass, Dan hugged Yeon-so, put her on the sofa, when Dan was at a loss for how to explain the wings on her back. Yeon-so said first that she didn't expect Dan to have such a trivial hobby of dressing up. While talking, she rushed forward to remove Dan's wings. Seeing that Dan could only push Yo aside and run outside, the rain outside the window suddenly stopped. Dan's wings also disappeared. At this time, outside Yeon-so's house, Kang-woo was visiting her. He heard the sound of broken glass from afar. Because he was worried, he rushed in himself. Just as he reached the hallway, he met Dan. Dan thought he was a thief who broke the glass and broke in, so he rushed up fight with Kang-woo until Yeon-so heard the sound coming. Only then did she know that the man in front of her was Kang-woo, the new director of the dance troupe. After clearing up the misunderstanding, Yeon-so still had no sympathy for Kang-woo. She coldly ordered the guests to be sent off, but Kang-woo did not want to give up, wanting to talk to Yeon-so as the new director. Dan stood up and didn't say much, inviting him out of the house. Kang-woo was frustrated and could only drive away. As soon as he reached the front of the house, he immediately felt someone following behind him, and that person was Nina. Nina hurriedly explained that she was not stalking Kang-woo, but just wanted to go to a nearby store. Kang-woo only needed to glance at her to know she was lying, but he still invited her to have dinner together. At the dinner table, Nina said that she really hoped Yeon-so could return to the stage because her talent and skill were exceptional, like a gift from God. If Yeon-so were to return, she would be willing to step aside at any time. After saying this, Nina made an excuse to go to the restroom, but when she came back, Kang-woo grabbed her hand and leaned in to examine her facial muscles. He knew that Nina had gone to the restroom to vomit in order to control her weight, which is extremely harmful to the body. In response to Nina's explanation, Kang-woo forcefully pulled her to the window to look at herself, telling her that to become an elite dancer, she should be selfish and put loving herself first. The next day, Yeon-so called the neighborhood security staff, asking them to review the surveillance video from the previous night to find out who broke the window. Dan thought about the scene from the day before when his wings had appeared, which might have been caught on camera. As he was feeling uneasy, the security staff informed him that the surveillance system might have been damaged by the storm that night, that make it impossible to see who broke the window. Hearing that, Dan finally felt more at ease as he was seeing off the security guard. He suddenly realized that the guard was actually a high-ranking angel in disguise who had come specifically to help Dan overcome the danger. Dan and his senior tried to figure out the reason for the sudden appearance of his wings. After thinking it again and again, he felt it was very likely due to the rain. Meanwhile, as the high-ranking angel left, Kang-woo brought along an uninvited police officer. It turned out his grandmother was also concerned about the attack on Yeon-so's house last night, but such decisive action made Yeon-seo feel very uncomfortable. After the police had finished their investigation and left, Yeon-so dragged Dan, getting ready to drive out, not giving Kang-woo a chance to talk. But then an awkward situation occurred. Dan confessed with an apologetic look that he didn't know how to drive, leaving Kang-woo no choice but to be the temporary driver. Taking Yeon-so and Dan to the funeral home, Yeon-so went to her parents' and Secretary Cho's memorials, crying because she missed them. This changed Dan's view of Yeon-so. She wasn't as cold-hearted as she seemed. As they left the funeral home, Dan told Yeon-so that he would help her regain hope because his purpose on Earth was Yeon-seo. This statement sounded like a declaration of love, making Yeon-so momentarily panic. Just then, it started to rain. Dan hurried back to the funeral home to borrow an umbrella, but he suddenly remembered that when it rains, his wings would appear. So Dan didn't dare to immediately return to Yeon-so. While Yeon-so was waiting for Dan, Kang-woo seized the opportunity to approach her. Yeon-so did not expect that Kang-woo would carry a projector with him. He began to play back the wonderful moments from Yeon-so's past dances, praising her as someone born to dance ballet, inviting Yeon-so to return. Although Yeon-so clearly refused, the hidden emotions in her heart were still faintly surging. When Kang-woo brought the two of them back home, Yeon-so accidentally learned that the person who helped her call the police on the day of the car accident was Kang-woo. At this moment, Dan also realized the connection between them, guessing that Kang-woo was Yeon-seo's destined love. One day, when Yeon-seo and Dan had just returned home, they discovered that her family had entered the house without permission. They hypocritically organized a discharge celebration for Yeon-seo, but in fact, her aunt secretly entered Secretary Cho's room to take away all the investigations about her preventing the corneal transplant while he was still alive. Yeon-seo only felt angry. Without realizing her aunt's scheme, she loudly ordered her aunt's family to leave. Dan was puzzled by Yeon-seo's attitude, not knowing what kind of person her aunt was, only thinking that Yeon-seo was extreme and indifferent. Because of this, the two had a big argument, even attacking each other. Yeon-seo, in anger, immediately fired Dan. Dan was not to be outdone, immediately left Yeon-seo's house. A while later, the housekeeper went to Dan to invite him to drink with him, advising him to bow down and apologize to Yeon-seo Yeon-seo. Dan, drunken, returned to Yeon-seo's house. With the help of the wine, Dan tied a silk scarf around Yeon-seo's wrist, telling her to consider the scarf as him staying with her in the future. Then Dan pulled her into a dance. Dan, in drunk, said that Yeon-seo's dance was the most beautiful scenery in the world. After saying these words, Dan drunkenly collapsed on Yeon-seo's shoulder. But when he woke up the next morning, Dan was taken away by the police. It turned out that Yeon-seo had called the police, accusing the person who had been fired but still broke into her private home. Dan immediately begged for her mercy. At this point, Yeon-seo demanded that Dan confess his purpose in approaching her. It turned out that last night, after falling asleep, Dan started talking nonsense, and what he said was similar to what the man on the bench in the park said when Yeon-seo lost her sight. So Yeon-seo guessed that Dan had been approaching her for a long time, even planning to become her secretary. Hearing this, Dan didn't know how to explain. In fact, it was true. He could only vaguely say that he was indeed sent by someone above to approach Yeon-seo, but the above in Dan's mouth referred to God. But Yeon-seo misunderstood it as her family. Without saying much, she told the police to take this spy away. That day, the ballet company held an emergency meeting because Kang-woo announced that Yeon-seo would take the lead position in the ballet company, but he had not yet convinced Yeon-seo to return. Facing criticism from the investors, Kang-woo immediately declared that he would definitely get Yeon-seo to hold a press conference and personally announce her return. On the other hand, Yeon-seo also accidentally learned that news of her upcoming return had started spreading online. She knew it must be Kang-woo who did this. She went straight to the dance troupe and made it clear to Kang-woo that her return was impossible, no matter how much Kang-woo tried to persuade her. Yeon-seo ignored him. When Yeon-seo returned home, she received a letter from her aunt. Inside was a contract for an extension of her appointment. At this moment, her aunt also called. She was burning the documents that Secretary Cho had investigated about the corneal donation and said that Yeon-seo's behavior was inappropriate. Since she did not receive approval from the board, she could only continue to replace Yeon-seo, taking over the role of head of the dance troupe and chairman of the corporation. If Yeon-seo did not agree, she would have to hold a press conference to announce her return to ease the council's doubts. Yeon-seo despised her aunt's hypocrisy. She absolutely refused to sign the extension contract. She promised her aunt that she would definitely appear at the press conference in a healthy image, but the reality was not as wished. Once Yeon-seo was in trouble, she could not move on her own, which made her remember Dan. It seemed that only with Dan could Yeon-seo be normal. But after Dan was fired, all the household staff in Yeon-seo's house could not endure her temper and resigned, leaving only 2 people in the house, herself and the housekeeper Yumi. That day, the housekeeper brought in a maid, telling Yeon-seo that this maid had once worked in the dance troupe and had seen the household guard accepting bribes from her aunt, and he was the one who broke the window glass that day. Realizing she had wronged Dan, Yeon-seo began to feel guilty, searching everywhere for Dan. To combine the 2 people together, finally she met Dan on the bench where they first met. Yeon-seo suggested he return to work at her home. Dan happily agreed, but he requested Yeon-seo to agree to 3 aspirations. On the other side, her aunt, wanting to create trouble for Yeon-seo, had been spreading the word that she would appear at the press conference. If something happened to Yeon-seo at the press conference, her aunt would take this opportunity to eliminate Yeon-seo and take over the entire corporation. Thus, the temporary chairman would become the real chairman. So this time, Yeon-seo could not be careless. To prevent her aunt from seizing her family's assets, she began rehabilitation training with Dan's company. Yeon-seo was like a baby learning to walk and accidentally fell to the ground. Dan went up to help her up. The 2 fell to the ground together. The atmosphere was very ambiguous. Then Dan said he wanted to use his first wish, which was to take Yeon-seo to the temple to pray for blessings. After they arrived at the temple, they unexpectedly met Kang-woo. In fact, this chance meeting was arranged by Dan and Kang-woo. Dan was certain that Kang-woo was Yeon-seo's destined love. Dan suggested helping Kang-woo persuade Yeon-seo to return to the stage. While at the pagoda, Dan made an excuse to leave. He stood from a distance watching Yeon-seo and Kang-woo, hoping that her other half was someone who could make her happy. A few days later, the press conference proceeded as scheduled. Yeon-seo wore a white outfit, appearing before the cameras with elegant steps, announcing her adoption of the position as head of the dance troupe and her return, strongly shattering all of her aunt's calculations. Dan, to celebrate Yeon-seo's successful press conference, shared a celebratory drink with her on stage. Yeon-seo, to thank him, intended to give Dan a kiss on the cheek, but unexpectedly, Dan turned his head, resulting in them kissing each other. Yeon-seo was so nervous that she spoke incoherently. In the next moment, Dan took the initiative to kiss Yeon-seo. This scene was seen by Kang-woo, and the sight of them kissing deeply stirred his heart. Unexpectedly, Kang-woo also had a pair of wings spreading from his back. Soon the sky began to rain heavily. Dan anxiously ran around to get out of Yeonso's sight, fearing that his wings would grow back soon. Yeonso didn't understand why Dan ran away after the kiss, and could only stand there sulking. At this moment, Kangwoo sheltered Yeonso with an umbrella from behind and took her home. On the way, Kangwoo said he would give Yeonso 2 weeks to recover, hoping she wouldn't embarrass him. These words sparked Yeonso's desire to win. She declared that she only needed 1 week to return to the state Kangwoo desired. After kissing Yeonso, Dan felt a sense of guilt in his heart, making him unsure how to face Yeonso. But the senior angel did not give him a chance to hesitate, using the threat of losing his soul to force Dan to continue with Yeonso to complete his mission. Finally, after Dan spent a night comforting himself, then the next morning he returned to Yeonso's house. Yeonso also developed different feelings for Dan. She waited in the living room for Dan all night, despite her fierce intention to discharge him. Her resolve was shaken upon seeing him. When Dan took Yeonso to the dance studio, he suggested that they forget about what happened the previous night and return to how things were when they first met. Although Yeonso agreed to Dan's suggestion, she harbored feelings of reluctance and dissatisfaction. Yeonso's rehabilitation training did not go smoothly. She could not complete the spinning move after falling to the ground. Dan immediately rushed into the room to help her up. Yeonso pushed his hand away, insisting that he need not concern himself with her. At that moment, Dan's phone rang. Yeonso heard it was Nina calling. She immediately grabbed the phone and warned Nina not to contact her secretary casually. After that, Yeonso took her pet and prepared to go out for a walk. Unexpectedly, Nina was waiting for her at the front door. Nina gave a gift to congratulate Yeonso on her return, and also issued a challenge, stating that she wanted to formally compete for the position of troop leader against Yeonso. The news of Yeonso's return brought much attention to the group and attracted the interest of a wealthy and famous businessman who was willing to invest in the troupe just to see Yeonso perform. Meanwhile, internal of company rumors were spreading about the aunt relinquishing control of the troupe and returning it to Yeonso, which made investors hesitant to do business with her, believing talking to her was futile if she was about to resign. This situation left the aunt extremely didn't make up her mind. She did not want to give up a career she had sacrificed so much for to Yeonso. Thus, she made a final attempt, aiming to prove that Yeonso's physical and mental state was still unstable. She moved the troupe's annual performance to a much earlier date, intending for something to go wrong for Yeonso on that day so she could smoothly take over the company. On the other hand, Kangwoo was very concerned about the relationship between Yeonso and Dan. He went to Yeonso's house to check on her training progress, but saw Dan practicing with her. This only intensified Kangwoo's anger. He privately warned Dan that if he did not genuinely like Yeonso, he should not use these feelings to affect her heart. Hearing this, Dan began to reflect on the meaning of liking someone. He sought out the senior angel and shared that since the kiss with Yeonso, his heart raced every time she came near, and he was unsure if this was love. Hearing Dan's confusion, the senior angel recounted a story from 15 years ago to warn Dan. At that time, an angel fell in love with a human dancer and was ultimately punished by God and turned to dust. Dan did not realize that the protagonist of this story was Kangwoo and a girl who resembled Yeonso. Dan then returned to his duties. Yeonso practiced day and night, even though her toenails bled continuously. Seeing this, Dan was heartbroken and even wiped the blood off Yeonso's feet. At this moment, Yeonso asked if Dan liked her. Dan hesitated. Having just heard the story of the angel who turned to dust, he was even more reluctant to admit his feelings. Dan's denial left Yeonso disappointed. She kicked Dan out of the dance studio and continued to immerse herself in training. A week quickly passed. On that day, the aunt arranged a meeting with Yeonso. She mentioned that for the upcoming troupe gala, she had invited an important investor and instructed Yeonso to carefully entertain him, saying that without this wealthy businessman's investment, it would be very difficult for Yeonso to complete her comeback performance. Due to business pressure, Yeonso agreed to this request. After meeting with her aunt, Kangwoo appeared at the door waiting for Yeonso. It turned out Dan had found a photo of Yeonso as a child dancing ballet by the sea, with a note on the back saying, "The first time dancing ballet," to help Yeonso regain her initial intention to dance and to rekindle the love between Kangwoo and Yeonso. Dan set up a small stage similar to the one in the photo by the sea and asked Kangwoo to take her there. Encouraged by Kangwoo, Yeonso once again stood on the small stage and danced to the melody. Watching Yeonso dance, Dan was reminded of a scene from years ago when a young Yeonso was in ballet and there was a boy was an audience. Dan retained his heart. This piercing feelings experienced him both joy and regret. The joy from seeing Yeonso's beauty in dance, and regret for having led Yeonso to another person. After meeting Yeonso, Kangwoo went to the funeral home to visit Sol-hee, who had passed away. She was the human dancer Kangwoo had loved 15 years ago. This love had to be accepted as punishment due to his angelic status. Sol-hee saw Kangwoo with his eyes closed, looking as if life was worse than death. She hurried to stop him from taking his own life, dying in Kangwoo's arms. Since then, Kangwoo had tried to leave the world countless times, wanting to become human, but was never successful. And time passed until 15 years later, at the troops gala, Yeon-seo appeared at the venue dressed and made up. Before going, she took a large amount of stimulants to avoid relying on Dan. When the businessman saw Yeon-seo, he revealed a wolf in sheep's clothing, taking the opportunity to touch Yeon-seo. But Yeon-seo knew this was the helplessness of entertainment with investors, so she endured the entire way. Originally, her aunt had decided at this event to announce her retirement from the troupe and transfer power to Yeon-seo, but with her character, she would never compromise like that. As expected, the aunt had arranged for someone to drug Yeon-seo's drink, causing her to embarrass herself in front of high society and miss the investment opportunity. But the aunt's scheme was thwarted by Dan. Dan recalled the butler's advice to be extremely cautious at the dinner venue and noticed a man acting suspiciously, but without evidence of wrongdoing. He had to give up. Later, Dan returned to the venue and saw the aunt's plan, which involved a waiter spilling wine on Yeon-seo, causing her to fall. Seeing the plan fail, the aunt immediately sent a message to Manager Park, instructing him to bring 2 more glasses of drugged water. Manager Park, feeling tense, completed the task, only to be advised by Yeon-seo's uncle, who stood behind him, to refrain from doing anything wrong. Hearing this, Manager Park had no choice but to give up. Unexpectedly, Nina's sister, Runa, also arranged for someone to sabotage Yeon-seo. She injected hallucinogens into the fruits, and Yeon-seo was unaware then, picked it up and ate it. When the aunt took the stage to announce that Yeon-seo would take over, Yeon-seo stood up and immediately felt dizzy, then began to lose control and directly insulted the businessman as a lousy old man. When Dan arrived, Yeon-seo was stumbling around the deck, each step trembling. Dan rushed forward and held her. Yeon-seo fainted under Dan's gentle gaze. The next day, when Yeon-seo woke up, she recalled what she had done the previous day. Feeling extremely strange, she did not drink alcohol, but showed a drunken state. She immediately found a doctor to do a blood test. At the same time, Yeon-seo's out-of-control state caused her to lose the investment of the rich businessman. The aunt took this opportunity to join forces with other investors to put pressure on Kang-woo, but Kang-woo was completely unwilling to compromise in his heart. Yeon-seo was the absolute protagonist of the dance troupe. No matter what, she would not be replaced. This answer disappointed the investor. In anger, he proposed to withdraw all investments in the dance troupe. Kang-woo angrily returned to the practice room, only to see the other dancers on strike to express their dissatisfaction with Yeon-seo. They did not accept a madman becoming the leader. Kang-woo heard their words, and the anger in his heart completely exploded. He vented all his anger on Nina, asserting that when Yeon-seo stood on stage, she carried the blood and soul of dance, while Nina only had emptiness empty. This criticism completely broke Nina. She went to the bar drunk, accidentally met her childhood dance teacher. Nina wanted to go up to talk to her, but was cruelly chased away by the dance teacher and Dan. In order to investigate whether Yeon-seo had been framed, went to Runa to ask for her help. But Dan did not expect that the mastermind behind it was Runa, who was sitting in front of him. Runa, of course, would not help Dan investigate. After saying a few words, she chased Dan away. But she also paid attention to this newly appointed secretary. Dan had just returned home when his aunt also came to the door to find Yeon-seo. This time, she no longer hid her ambition, directly tore up the contract extension, using the excuse that Yeon-seo had made a mistake that caused the group to lose a large number of investors, directly asking Yeon-seo to hand over the entire group to her. The aunt's meanness made Dan, who was standing by, extremely angry. He scolded the aunt for what she said, questioning her as Yeon-seo's only relative. But why did she harm her instead of helping her? But after hearing that, the aunt did not waver at all before leaving. She gave Yeon-seo 12 hours to think, threatening that if she did not want the corporation founded by her parents to disintegrate, Yeon-seo had to hand over the power to her. That night, Yeon-seo sadly went to the bar to get drunk. The housekeeper told her that the display report showed that there were hallucinogens in her blood, but because Yeon-seo had taken brain-enhancing drugs, this report was very difficult to be used as evidence that she was framed. Things had come to this point. Regarding Yeon-seo's continued dancing, she also had a big blow in her heart. Seeing the girl she loved suffering like this, Dan persuaded her to put aside her passion for theater and ballet. If she wanted to dance, Dan was willing to be her audience. After Yeon-seo finished speaking, she began to act gracefully in front of the only audience, and when she couldn't stand, she fell into Dan's arms. Dan carried the drunk Yeon-seo home. Seeing Yeon-seo in pain, he felt very sad. After Yeon-seo went to sleep, Dan went to the bridge to get some fresh air. At this moment, Kang-woo suddenly appeared. He threatened Dan to leave Yeon-seo. During the struggle, they both fell into the river. Dan passed out after falling into the water. When he woke up again, the medical staff was giving him first aid, but Kang-woo was nowhere to be seen. After being taken to the hospital, Dan was still wondering why Kang-woo would suddenly do such a thing to him. Unless he heard him advise advise Yeonso to give up her ballet career, which was true. Kangwoo heard the conversation between the two of them. Immediately after speaking, Kangwoo lifted the curtain beside the bed and told Dan clearly that after Yeonso lost her vision, she had once tried to leave this world. Since she was born a dancer, dancing was Yeonso's life, and giving up ballet would be a lifetime of torment for her. However, Dan not only failed to encourage Yeonso to move forward courageously, but also said things that made her want to give up. Kangwoo hoped Dan would voluntarily resign and not be a negative influence on Yeonso. Otherwise, he would not be so lenient with him. Dan chased after Kangwoo, admitting that he liked Yeonso and therefore could not just leave. He also felt a heavy responsibility to restore Yeonso's happiness. To him, Kangwoo was Yeonso's happiness. With the 12 hours given by the aunt almost up, Yeonso was not in a hurry and continued to practice ballet. At this moment, the butler rushed in, bringing the blood test report to Yeonso, hoping she could use it for something. Just then, the aunt called to threatening Yeonso that if she did not attend the board meeting today, she would directly announce her takeover of the dance troupe. Yeonso responded that she would definitely appear. Dan, who having just received his driver's license, was on his way to take Yeonso to the meeting when he suddenly turned the car around and took her to the bridge where he had fallen into the water the previous night. He stood on the precarious railing, trying to understand Yeonso's mindset when she jumped off the bridge. Seeing this, Yeonso was terrified and instinctively clung to Dan, fearing he might fall. After they landed, Dan told Yeonso that although he had encouraged her to let go of everything, he knew that for Yeonso, ballet was the happiest moment. If Yeonso loved dancing, she should persist. No matter what choice Yeonso made, Dan would always be by her side. Under Dan's encouragement, Yeonso returned to the company full of energy. She ignored the aunt's gaze, directly engaged with the investors, first apologizing for her behavior at the dance troupe's event, and then promising that her next performance would be her final battle. If she failed, she would willingly step down from both the troupe and the company. After the meeting, the aunt was furious and fined Yeonso. According to her, since Yeonso's parents passed away, she had always invested her time and energy into the troupe, and Yeonso was the one who had intruded and stolen her efforts. Although the investors agreed to give Yeonso a chance, the aunt would continue to fight against her. As expected, the troupe members began a strike to protest Yeonso, hoping to negotiate with Kangwoo. However, Kangwoo's attitude was even more resolute, directly declaring that anyone absent the next day would be fired. Yeonso felt that Kangwoo's pressure on the troupe members would only push them further away. While she was wondering how to integrate into the troupe, Dan suggested that Yeonso seek help from Nina. As Nina was not like the aunt or Runa, she was a kind-hearted girl. Heeding Dan's advice, Yeonso called Nina for help. Anyway, that after joining the troupe, the two of them would be able to openly square up against each other. Nina was moved by these remarks, and then she told Yeonso the positions of the members. Recently, the dancers had been going to the nursing home to be volunteers. Yeonso joined them to interact with the elderly. But during this time, an elderly woman caused a fire by accidentally knocking over a candle. Yeonso stepped up to take responsibility for the incident in order to protect the elderly woman. Seeing that Yeonso caused the trouble, the members of the dance troupe were very dissatisfied and even told her directly not to think that pretending to participate in collective activities would win people over. The members' attitude made Yeonso realize where the problem of not being welcomed lay. It was being the center of attention on stage. So she specially called Kangwoo to the nursing home to have him start reselecting the performers, including herself. She would prove that she could take on the responsibility of leading the dance troupe, and if she really did not meet the standards, Yeonso was willing to start with group dancing. Yeonso's words were finally acknowledged by the members, and everyone returned to the dance troupe to continue training as usual. One day, Kangwoo happened to notice Dan's hands. He remembered the day he fell into the water. Dan was clearly injured, but now there were no signs of it at all. With suspicion, Kangwoo began to follow Dan, discovering that he met a senior angel at the supermarket. Kangwoo continued to the church to find the senior angel for confirmation. Indeedly, he found out that Dan was also an angel. On the other side, Dan kept dreaming of a scene where a girl and a boy were playing, which confused him greatly. So Dan carried doubts went to ask the senior angel, but the senior angel told him that this was because Dan's heart was gradually yearning to be human, which is why such dreams appeared. To dispel Dan's desire to become human, the senior angel turned the companion of the elderly woman at the nursing home into ashes right before his eyes. It turned out he was also an angel. After learning that the companion by her side had disappeared, the elderly woman cried out in great sorrow. Dan, seeing the elderly woman in Yunso's appearance, suddenly realized that he should not be by Yunso's side. He should not continue to sink deeper into this relationship. Otherwise, when he disappears, Yunso would be very heartbroken. He immediately returned home and offered his resignation to Yunso. Hearing this, Yunso was deeply hurt by Dan's abrupt departure. She held on to Dan, but seeing his firm resolve, Yunso angrily instructed the butler to process Dan's resignation immediately, hoping that the two of them would never meet again. After Dan left, Kangwoo called him wanting to meet, but the butler answered the phone. It was then that Kangwoo realized Dan had left Yunso's side. Although this was the result Kangwoo had hoped for, he still worried about a celestial being like Dan approaching Yunso. Yunso, who had just faced a romantic issue, also had to endure isolation when she returned to the dance troupe, but she endured it all, waiting with everyone for the choice of performance. But the aunt announced that Kangwoo would not be a judge this time because she felt that Kangwoo could not maintain fairness. Kangwoo, hearing this, also told the aunt to withdraw from the judging panel, leaving the decision-making to the members of the dance troupe. Let them choose their own leader. Kangwoo's actions to act on his own wishes made Runa very dissatisfied. Seeing Runa's sinister expression, the aunt could not help but remember what her husband had once said. Yunso's uncle was very kind and did not let the aunt harm those around her for personal gain. Upon learning that the collision involving Secretary Cho was due to someone cutting the brakes, Yunso's uncle believed that his wife wanted to kill Secretary Cho. After discovering the truth, the aunt was also very shocked. Although she craved power, it was not to the extent of wanting to kill Yunso, and she began to suspect that the person responsible for these actions was her own daughter Runa. Meanwhile, Yunso endured many grievances in the dance troupe and missed Dan even more. That day after practice ended, she went to the bench where they first met and confessed her longing to Dan. After hearing Yunso's hurt and insecurity, Dan stepped out from the nearby tree, telling Yunso not to see him as a support. His initial gentleness towards her was merely out of pity. Now that Yunso had recovered as usual, it was time to let him go, to find someone who could truly love her. Hearing Dan's cold words, Yunso resolutely turned around before Dan left. She wanted Dan to remember that this time it was not she who was abandoned, but rather she who actively distanced herself from Dan. After Dan resigned, he did not go to the church, but stayed at the nursing home to care for the elderly woman who had lost her companion. That day, after the elderly woman woke up, she begged Dan to take her to her old man. It turned out she had always known that her old man was an angel. They had spent over 70 years together, loving each other since their youth. Going through separations and reunions, the path of love was full of twists and turns. Now that she had reached old age, she took out a handkerchief dedicated to angels, hoping that in the next life, her old man must be human. Although the elderly woman knew that loving an angel could not be perfect, she did not regret it, as every encounter in life was fate. No one else would treat her as kindly as her husband. Having a chance to experiencing such a love, she would not regret even if she died. After saying these words, the elderly woman passed away in Dan's arms. After the elderly woman's death, Dan decided to find the place that frequently appeared in his dreams. He wanted to know what emotions were buried in his heart. On the other side, the first official selection began. When Nina took the stage, she covered her eyes. It turned out that since she met her childhood ballet teacher, she had desperately begged her teacher to help her. The method of covering the eyes was taught by her teacher. Although she was well prepared, Nina's performance was still rejected by Kangwoo. Next was Yunso. The theme of this ballet was a sad story. Yunso thought of Dan while performing the image of a girl in distress. Her emotions were integrated into her body movements, affecting all the members. After the performance, she received a round of applause. After Dan began his journey, following the memory of a rural area, he asked the locals about the house that appeared in his dreams. When Dan arrived at this abandoned house, it suddenly started to rain heavily. Memories flooded back. He saw the boy from his childhood, who was beaten by his drunk father every time it rained. Relying on his memory, Dan retrieved a box from a huge jar in the yard. Inside were pictures of a boy and a girl, along with drawings of the two children dancing on the beach, with the names of the two children written below, and the girl's name was Yunso. Dan finally remembered that the boy in the memory was himself. Suddenly, Dan seemed to sense something. He hurried to the beach embankment, just as Yunso arrived at this place. Since Dan left, Yunso's feelings for him were not hatred, but love and longing. Because of this feeling, when Yunso performed the sad ballet, her entire being being was imbued with sadness and a longing for love, but this was not the artistic feeling Kang Woo wanted, and Yeonso was criticized by Kang Woo for this. When she returned home, she dreamt of a boy who used to play with her as a child, which also made Yeonso feel strange, wondering why she thought of that boy at this time. After the butler heard this, she said that Yeonso must have been under a lot of pressure recently, which was why she dreamed about the place where she lived as a child. It would be better to go back there to relax. So the next day, Yeonso took a leave of absence and went alone to the village she had visited as a child. Unexpectedly, she encountered Dan, whom she had not seen for a long time right here. The person she had missed day and night was right in front of her. But Yeonso maintained her pride and did not reveal her longing to Dan. She turned and went into the village to ask an old woman by the roadside if there had been a boy living in a house with a blue door. Yeonso clearly remembered that the first time she met the boy was on a rainy day. She saw the boy standing precariously on the beach, so she threw down the umbrella she was holding and went to hug him, pulling him away from the embankment. Later, they often played together, until one day, Yeonso told the boy that she would go abroad to study ballet. Before going abroad, Yeonso performed a dance on the beach for him. On that day, the boy saw a rainbow for the first time after the rain, and also saw the most beautiful thing in the world, which was Yeonso. It was Yeonso who made him want to continue striving to live. But to Yeonso, the boy was her first audience, and he was also the one who taught Yeonso how to dance in a way that touched people's hearts. But the old woman in the village told Yeonso that the boy had died after accidentally falling into the water while trying to avoid being beaten by his father. At that moment, Dan was standing in front of the rock where he had fallen into the water. The memory of his death resurfaced in his mind, making him clutch his head and cry out in sorrow. Yeonso was also saddened by the boy's death. She went to the flower field where they used to play as children. At that time, Dan appeared. He comforted the crying Yeonso, saying that the boy must have remembered Yeonso before he died, because Yeonso was the happiest memory in his life. They both paid their respects to the boy on the beach. Yeonso wanted Dan to return to Seoul with her, but Dan knew he had not yet completely resolved the doubts in his heart, so he hoped Yeonso would wait for him a little longer. After he had fully resolved the knot in his heart, he would return to Yeonseo. This was also his wish. Before that, the handkerchief would temporarily accompany Yeonseo in his place. Dan turned and left, leaving Yeonseo standing alone on the beach, watching his sorrowful figure. This trip allowed Yeonseo to receive Dan's promise. This significantly improved her mood, clearly better. Yeonseo wrapped Dan's silk handkerchief around her handbag and told the butler that there was no need to interview a new secretary. Sooner or later, Dan would eventually return. Yeonseo continued with the dance troupe and resumed her practice. The day of the leader selection approached. On the ants side, and Runa began to plan the vote again, obtained the curriculum vitae of all members of the dance troupe, preparing to use benefits to bribe each person. Compared to the conspiracy of the ant and Runa, Yeonso practiced dancing day and night, aiming to win the position through her genuine abilities. That night, it suddenly started raining heavily, which made Yeonso think of Dan again. Not knowing where he was, at that moment, Dan was at a nursing home. The person he wanted to search for is his father, who had treated him poorly in the past. Seeing his father lying on his deathbed, Dan wept for the pain his father had caused him. After hearing Dan's words, his father slowly reached out to grasp Dan's hand, struggling to say 3 words, "I am sorry." Perhaps he had become accustomed to his father's harsh demeanor. This apology made Dan momentarily unable to accept it. He quickly ran out of the hospital room, while his father also took his last breath. After the apology, Dan's next investigation was the true identity of Kang Woo, because Kang Woo had previously discovered that Dan was an angel and had warned that angels should not stay with humans for too long. Only Dan could make Yeonso happy. Investigate with the help of the senior angel. Dan managed to break into Kang Woo's house, discovering that Sol-hee, whom Kang Woo loved deeply, was a woman identical to Yeonso. After realizing that Kang Woo only saw Yeonso as a replacement and not true love, Dan decided that he would be the one to fulfill the responsibility of making Yeonso happy. No matter how severe the punishment, he would not regret it. After having made this decision, Dan returned to Yeonso, promising that from now on, he would always be by her side and never leave her. After speaking, Dan gave Yeonso a kiss, which completely cleared the fog in her heart. The two connected their inseparable life as before, publicly acknowledging their relationship and expressing their affection freely. Just as Dan was about to kiss Yeonso again, that the butler interrupted. Meanwhile, the senior angel, that having heard Dan suspecting Kang Woo, specifically visited the temple that Kang Woo frequents to investigate. Upon seeing Sol-hee's spirit tablet, he immediately understood Kang Woo's true identity. The senior angel, intoxicated and stumbling in the church, was found by Kang Woo, who had come to the church intending to warn the senior angel and prevent Dan's wrongful actions. However, the senior angel called called Kangwoo over and revealed that Kangwoo was an angel forsaken by God who had become a human angel. They then sat together in front of the church and drank. The senior angel asked Kangwoo why he targeted Dan. Because of Kangwoo's wish to bring Yeon-seo on stage, and whenever he was close to Yeon-seo, feelings seemed to take root in his heart, which made him hate his rival, Dan, more and more. At this time, Dan no longer wanted to deceive Yeon-seo and wanted to be honest with her, revealing that he was the boy from her past, who after dying had become an angel by her side. Dan had been rehearsing in the room for a long time, but was afraid that Yeon-seo might find it too unbelievable to trust him. At this moment, Yeon-seo came to him, asking what Dan had been doing during his previous disappearance. Seeing Yeon-seo's concerned expression, Dan admitted he had visited his estranged father, who had once expelled him from home, to ask why he had treated him so harshly. Fortunately, Dan received an apology. Hearing this, Yeon-seo was moved and embraced Dan. The next day, members of the dance troupe were discussing in the hallway about the private connections of some group members with Runa. This made Kangwoo immediately suspect that Runa and the aunt were likely bribing the members to vote for Nina. Kangwoo angrily went straight to confront Runa, but Runa, with cunning characteristic, firmly denied the rumors, claiming they were unfounded and that the troupe should not cancel the voting based on mere hearsay. On the other side, the butlers secretly found the staff of the dance troupe's lighting department, who had been fired 3 years ago, and arranged for him to meet with Manager Park. Manager Park, who had always been forced to work for the aunt and was involved in many schemes harming others, was deeply troubled by this encounter. The former staff member revealed to Manager Park that Yeon-seo's injury 3 years ago was not due to an accident but was caused by someone. The three of them decided to go to the police station to report the incident after the selection performance. But this plan was overheard by Runa's subordinate, who promptly reported this information to Runa. Looking at the photo of the three people meeting, Runa showed a fierce expression. She was determined not to let them reveal what happened years ago. On the selection day, although Nina arrived late, she showed a completely different expression compared to before. It turned out that under the guidance of a ballet teacher, Nina had made a special trip to the cemetery the previous night to practice dancing in order to feel the passionate and desperate emotions of the female lead in the story. This practical rehearsal had indeed significantly improved Nina's expression after the performance. Even Kangwoo, who was always dissatisfied with Nina, had to stand up and applaud. Seeing Nina perform so excellently, Yeon-seo felt a bit nervous, but when she stood on stage and saw Dan standing behind her, she felt a surge of determination, and with the music playing, Yeon-seo performed a deep love story but could only end in separation on stage. Yeon-seo conveyed this twisted and enduring sadness to every audience member through her body language. After the performance ended, many people were moved to tears. In the final vote, Yeon-seo narrowly defeated Nina and became the lead performer. Nina was defeated, hid alone in the bathroom, and cried bitterly. When Runa found her, she heard Nina muttering to herself. She wished that Yeon-seo could die, so that no one would take her opportunity away anymore. Runa silently remembered these words in her heart. After leaving the dance troupe, Kangwoo wanted to invite Yeon-seo to dinner, but Yeon-seo didn't want to meet him in private. She turned around and held Dan's hand to go for a walk in the park. At that moment, it started to rain, which made Dan a little worried. Yeon-seo had always been very curious why Dan was so sensitive to the rain, so she jokingly asked if Dan would transform when it rained. After hearing this, Dan asked Yeon-seo in return if that were really the case, would she be afraid of him? Yeon-seo laughed and said she only wished that Dan could return to his original form. This statement reassured Dan a lot. Seeing that the rain was getting heavier, Dan crossed the street to buy an umbrella, but when he wasn't paying attention, Yeon-seo was nowhere to be seen on the side of the road. It turned out that Runa had already started to act. She not only created a traffic collision, killed a witness, but also ordered her subordinates to push Yeon-seo from the top floor of the dance troupe's building, disguising it as she departed this world by herself. As soon as Yeon-seo fell into the air, Dan spread his white wings and flew to hold her. The two landed safely on the ground. Yeon-seo was terrified and immediately fainted and was brought home by Dan. Runa's subordinate went down to the building's ground floor, but did not see Yeon-seo's body, which made him feel strange. To confirm whether Yeon-seo was dead, he sneaked into her house again. At that moment, Dan was in the house and heard a strange noise. He cautiously approached the door and saw someone watching over Yeon-seo. The subordinate immediately fled. He then received a call from Runa and went to meet her right away. Runa told her subordinate not to get involved in this matter anymore, to avoid exposing the truth. As soon as the subordinate left, Runa instantly transformed back into the senior angel. It turned out this was just a trick he used. The real Runa Runa was at a restaurant waiting for news of Yeonso's death. However, after waiting for half a day, she instead encountered Kang Woo. It turned out that Kang Woo had received a message, suspected to be Yeonso's suicide note, written that she would die on the top floor of the dance troupe's building. When Kang Woo arrived at the building, he happened to see Dan with wings holding Yeonso as they landed. Kang Woo immediately realized that Yeonso had been harmed again by her aunt's family. Therefore, he went to find Runa, warned her not to do any more evil to Yeonso. Yeonso woke up, but she lost her memory after being captured, only remembering that Dan went across the street to buy an umbrella, and then she fainted. Dan didn't know if this was a good thing or a bad thing. On one hand, he was glad Yeonso no longer had the terrifying memories, but on the other hand, it felt like a disguised form, made him delay the opportunity to tell the truth. At that moment, Yeonso realized her mobile phone was missing, so to help her find it, Dan went to the location where she fell, found the phone in the grass. When he turned on the screen, he saw the farewell notes Yeonso had sent to Kang Woo. This was clearly not something Yeonso did. Dan immediately suspected her aunt's family, because only they would want Yeonso dead so badly. That night, Dan talked with the senior angel, expressing how disheartened he felt with the aunt's family. Dan couldn't understand how blood relatives could be so ruthless. Hearing that Dan was trying to empathize with humans, the senior angel immediately stopped him, telling Dan he should fear the punishment of God. Hearing this, Dan asked the senior angel if Yeonso's memory loss was caused by him. The senior angel did not deny it and warned Dan once again that every human has their own destiny, and as an angel, he must not favor anyone. Such behavior is unfair to all beings. That was the most selfish moment of an angel. The next day, Yeonso went to the dance troupe as if nothing had happened, which surprised both her aunt and Runa, especially Runa. She immediately called her subordinate, asking him why his work was so ineffective, that even pushing Yeonso from the 10th floor couldn't kill her. While Runa was on the phone, her aunt was listening from behind and heard that Runa really wanted to eliminate Yeonso, which made her aunt feel fearful. The dance troupe training just started today. Nina reached out to Kang Woo, expressing a strong attitude that she didn't want to play any other roles and only wanted the lead role, even if it meant being a backup for Yeonso. Nina's approach was still taught by her teacher, who taught Nina that to take such positions, firstly, one must not easily compromise. Dan stayed at the dance troupe's building waiting for Yeonso to finish work, and suddenly saw Runa's subordinate unexpectedly. He remembered that night on the dance troupe's boat, and it was the same person who had secretly moved around the boat. It was very likely that he had drugged Yeonso. Dan followed him all the way to Runa's office, confirming that his suspicion was indeed correct. After that, Dan intercepted Runa at the garage, warning her that he had seen the wicked and filthy nature of Runa, and that he would protect Yeonso afterwards, not allowing Runa to harm her. Runa continued to receive warnings from Kang Woo and Dan, but she arrogantly ignored them. After Dan found the phone, he did not return it to Yeonso, but kept it himself. However, his excessive concern for Yeonso in recent days had instead made Yeonso suspicious. To find out the reason for Dan's concern, Yeonso came up with a small plan, using the excuse of asking Dan to clean the dance studio and then going to his room. While searching, she discovered her phone. Yeonso immediately turned it on and saw the message, which made the color drain from her face. She was angry that Dan had hidden this from her and directly went to find Kang Woo. Yeonso asked Kang Woo what the message was about, but Kang Woo did not directly answer the question, only saying that he did not want Yeonso to remember this painful matter. Therefore, he chose not to tell her, but Yeonso was stubborn. After not getting an answer from Kang Woo, she called Dan, saying she had gone to the place where Dan bought the umbrella, and if Dan did not tell her the truth, then they should not speak to each other anymore. After hanging up, Yeonso went to the shop where Dan bought the umbrella, but from the shop owner's mouth, she heard a different version of what had happened. On that day after Dan bought the umbrella, Yeonso did not faint but had disappeared. A while later, Dan ran over, and as he was about to speak, but Yeonso interrupted him first, asking if Dan was an angel. After being reminded by the shop owner, Yeonso gradually remembered what happened that night, including the scene of Dan spreading his wings to save her. Facing Yeonso's question, Dan did not want to lie anymore and had to admit that he was indeed an angel. However, Yeonso was angry because Dan had hidden this from her for so long. She didn't care if Dan was an angel or a devil. She only hated the feeling of being deceived. Yeonso angrily ran away, and Dan followed her, telling Yeonso that no matter how much she tried to drive him away, he would not leave because there were still people waiting for the opportunity to harm Yeonso. He must stay by her side to protect her, and under Dan's persistence being on her tail, that Yeonso was eventually moved. She was no longer angry with Dan. That evening, the two went to church together. Under Yeonseo's strict questioning, Dan had no choice but to reveal his mission to approach Yeonso, but he now realized that the person who could bring happiness to Yeonso was himself. The next day, Runa's people sent Yeonso another surveillance recording recording, which accurately recorded the conversation between the butler and manager Park. The butler lied that she had given up on everything and was no longer investigating how Yeon-so got injured. Hearing this, Runa was satisfied and removed her headphones. However, after the butler finished speaking, she suddenly grabbed manager Park's phone and threw it into the river. It turned out that the butler had told Yeon-so that she had found the staff member who investigated the accident that caused Yeon-so's loss of vision 3 years ago. She also heard that the staff member had an accident on the very day Yeon-so was arrested. Yeon-so guessed that Runa's people were probably monitoring manager Park when manager Park saw his phone being discarded. He still did not understand what had happened. At this moment, Yeon-so and Dan went out. Seeing Yeon-so then, manager Park felt even more ashamed. He knelt down and admitted that the death of Secretary Cho was also a directive from Runa. Heard that Secretary Cho was harmed by someone, Yeon-so could not control her sadness at the moment. She loudly condemned manager Park, saying that Secretary Cho was both kind and sincere, yet manager Park had ruthlessly erased him after the sorrow. Yeon-so told manager Park that if he wanted to atone for his sins, he should take this opportunity to provide evidence of Runa and her aunt's wrongdoing. After Yeon-so left, she was still heartbroken over Secretary Cho that he was out of her life. She could understand why her family wanted to harm her, but she had never thought that such a kind person as Secretary Cho would be involved and pass away. So Yeon-so blamed God. Hearing this, Dan took her to the fountain plaza, where she saw a few fountains spouting water and a rainbow appearing behind the water. Dan also admitted that he was indeed Yeon-so's childhood friend, and for many years he had come to Earth in the form of an angel to protect Yeon-so. This was the directive from God that Yeon-so was blaming. God was very fair. He took Secretary Cho away, but brought Dan to Yeon-so. After speaking, Dan kissed the crying Yeon-so. Now Dan had revealed all his secrets to Yeon-so. The only remaining issue was how to become human to be with Yeon-so for life. So Dan went to ask Kang-woo for the method and learned that if an angel wanted to become human, they must let the person they love die. The next day, Yeon-so arrived at the dance troupe, and as Nina opened the cabinet, that a letter fell out. She opened it and saw that it said exactly that the injury to Yeon-so's eye 3 years ago was not caused by an accident, but was the result of her aunt's scheme. Nina was still in shock. Then Yeon-so approached her and whispered that she would not let the deception from 3 years ago succeed again. This letter was from manager Park, who had repented. Not only that, he had also written an explanatory letter and sent documents about Secretary Cho's accident to Yeon-so's home. After Yeon-so read it, she instructed the butler to immediately take the documents to the police station to report the case. However, due to a lack of direct evidence, the police had not yet identified the aunt and Runa as suspects. In order to find important evidence, Dan went to Runa's subordinate, using his angelic powers to tie him up on the roof of the dance troupe, then entered the subordinate's house and found personal documents and items of the erased staff. On the other hand, Yeon-so went to her aunt's house and presented manager Park's explanatory letter in front of Nina and her aunt, as well as a recording of her aunt trying to bribe members to vote against the performance. Nina, who upon learning that her mother had always done such dirty things, felt both angry and sad. Yeon-so threw all the evidence on the table. She suggested that if her aunt withdrew from the company voluntarily, Yeon-so would show leniency due to their blood relationship without sending her to jail. That night, Yeon-so received a call from Kang-woo, who invited her out to discuss about Dan. Hearing that it was related to Dan, Yeon-so immediately left the house secretly. After meeting, Kang-woo still wanted to pull Yeon-so away from this relationship. He told Yeon-so that if an angel and a human loved each other, the final outcome would be to turn to dust. After learning about this cruel governance, Yeon-so returned home in a daze, and as soon as she saw Dan, then she hugged him tightly. At that moment, Yeon-so felt a deep emotion. It seemed that their love, whether through separation or death, could only end in tragedy. This left Yeon-so in deep sorrow. Dan also knew that was the outcome, but he would do his best to find a way to achieve perfection. After Nina learned what her parents had done to Yeon-so, she was deeply disappointed. That night, she packed her things and moved out of the house. At the door, she met Runa. Nina cried and told her sister about their parents' actions, but Runa retorted that Yeon-so's misfortune was always Nina's fortune, telling her to face the growing darkness and desire in her heart. It was then that Nina realized that her family was just as dark. The next day at the board meeting of the company, her aunt was about to announce her resignation, but found that her uncle had organized a press conference. To protect the family, he took all the responsibility. After explaining everything to the reporters, the uncle was taken away by the police. The scandal of the company had made the members of the dance troupe anxious. They worried that the next performance would be affected, but Yeon-so and Kang-woo reassured everyone that they would never let the storm affect the performance. As soon as Yeon-so and Dan left the dance studio, they saw Runa waiting for her in the lobby, the two went to the stage. Runa unexpectedly knelt down in front of Yeonso, crying and begging her for forgiveness. But Yeonso knew that Runa just fall a fake tear, trying to pull her uncle out of prison. Perhaps that was what their family had done after consideration. Yeonso was not swayed. She knew that Runa was the culprit of everything. If one has committed a crime, they must pay for their sins. Seeing Yeonso's resolute refusal, Runa wiped her tears and restored her original appearance. Now that her family was in ruins, Runa had even become more insane. She warned Yeonso to be careful when going outside. Runa's words made Yeonso feel vigilant. After Dan found out, he also advised the butler to quickly catch Runa and her subordinates. After arranging everything, Yeonso suddenly had an idea. She took Dan to the shopping mall. The two took commemorative photos, but the more joyful the moments were, the more they reminded Yeonso of the truth that one day Dan would leave. Thinking of this, Yeonso couldn't hold back her tears. After Dan asked, he learned that Kang-woo had explained everything to Yeonso, including that he only had a month left to stay in this world, and that the punishment for a human and an angel loving each other would be to turn to dust. Dan could only comfort Yeonso by saying he would definitely become a human, and then went to warn Kang-woo not to say things that would confuse Yeonso anymore. That day, with the fresh air and bright moon, Yeonso called Dan, and the two went on a picnic together at the bench where they first met. Yeonso said she had found a way to make Dan human. She then took Dan to the church door and took out a pair of rings and proposed to Dan. Yeonso believed that as long as they swore to God never to give up, they could receive God's blessing. Although Dan thought Yeonso's idea was very naive, he couldn't bring himself to refuse when looking into her serious eyes. At that moment, a car on the road nearly hit a child. Dan immediately flew up to catch the child, injuring his arm. Dan didn't take it too seriously because he knew his injury would heal soon, but this time something unexpected happened. Dan's injury not only didn't heal, but he also fainted and had to be taken to the hospital. Yeonso discovered all of this, which seemed like a sign of becoming human. To verify if Dan was human, he and Yeonso were ready to wait for a rainstorm. If Dan could not spread his wings, it would mean he had become human. After waiting for many days, on a night when it started to rain heavily, Dan stood in the rain for a long time, but his wings still did not appear. Yeonso happily kissed him, glad that Dan had become human. That night, the two were closely together. Dan also joyfully reported to the senior angel the news that he had become human, but the senior angel said Dan had lost his angelic powers, which was a warning that his body had started to vanish. After learning the truth, Dan fell into despair. On the other side, the performance was about to start. During the rehearsal, Dan brought a bouquet of flowers to visit Yeonso. Sitting in the audience, Dan suddenly felt a strong gust of wind. In a closed performance hall, why would there be wind blowing? Dan couldn't help but look around and check. At that moment, Yeonso had disappeared from the stage. The senior angel came and said, "This is a sign of death. Yeonso will die on stage on the day of the performance. Some people are destined to be killed by evil." Even though Dan had once saved Yeonso's life in a car accident, fate was predetermined and unchangeable. After the rehearsal ended, Dan went towards Yeonso with the bouquet to propose. Yeonso cried with joy and hugged Dan tightly as they were discussing their wedding day. Dan once again solemnly proposed to Yeonso. He knew he could not be human, but still wanted to use his remaining strength to protect Yeonso's life. So on the day of the performance, Dan would still offer himself to prevent Yeonso's death. Even if he faded away, it would be all right. That night, Dan went to Yeonso to confess the truth to her, that he could not become a human. He also asked Yeonso to be prepared, that he might suddenly disappear one day. After saying this, Yeonso just held Dan's hand tightly. She was not worried about the unsurly goodbyes, only knowing that before they parted, she would always be by Dan's side. The two set their wedding date for a week later, then hand in hand went to the shopping district, starting to buy furniture for after the wedding. When they are choosing, the senior angel continuously transformed into various salespeople, saying things to drive a wedge between them. Dan saw through the senior angel's intentions and pulled him to another place, asking him why he was causing such chaos. The senior angel's goal was to save Dan, advising him not to sacrifice his life for someone who was about to die. Seeing that Dan was still not enlightened, the senior angel had no choice but to take action against Yeonso. Hearing this, Dan immediately rushed to fight the senior angel, hoping that he would no longer disturb their lives. At this point, Yeonso came over to stop their fight. The three of them sat in a cafe. The senior angel wanted to advise Yeonso, but she spoke up first. Yeonso sincerely requested that the senior angel become the officiant for their wedding. Seeing Yeonso wholeheartedly welcoming happiness, the senior angel could not withstand it and ultimately decided to let go and no longer interfere. On the other side, after being arrested, the aunt and uncle both wanted to take all the blame, but the true villain Runa still showed no remorse, once again bribing the stage lighting staff, intending to repeat what happened 3 years ago, causing harm to Yeonso. So. That evening, Dan went to Runa's office, warning her that she should turn back now and not commit any more crimes, or he would definitely kill her. Due to the bad deeds of her family, the stage performance had received a huge amount of refund requests from the audience, and the company immediately fell into crisis. So knew that if this issue could not be resolved properly, the dance troupe would only be overshadowed by scandal and gradually disappear. She immediately made a decisive decision to propose a press conference. So used the press conference to establish the performance as a new beginning for the dance troupe, hoping that the audience would forget the impact of the scandal and focus on appreciating and conveying the art. After the press conference, So gave Kangwoo a wedding invitation card, which she and Dan had personally designed. Kangwoo saw So falling in love and still wanted to achieve this love, but used words to dissuade her, saying that after Dan left, that So would have to endure the pain of losing her lover for the rest of her life. But So had already come to terms with everything. She replied that even a few seconds of deep affection could sometimes be enough to be remembered for a lifetime, and Kangwoo should be the one who understands this feeling the best. At this moment, Kangwoo finally revealed that the way to turn an angel into a human is to sacrifice oneself. So wanted to confirm this claim, then went to the church, but from the senior angel that she knows something. It turns out that the reason Dan returned to the mortal world to fulfill his mission was that on the day of the car accident involving her and Secretary Cho, he had violated the order and saved So. Knowing that Dan had silently paid the price for her, So decided that she would never let Dan die. Meanwhile, Nina ultimately decided to leave home and proactively cut off contact with her family, not wanting to be involved with those despicable people. This deeply angered Runa, and her hatred towards So grew even stronger. The next day, Runa brought a large amount of cash and handed it to the backstage staff. Fortunately, Dan had been keeping a close watch and eventually stirred up the accomplice, telling him to pretend to cooperate and continue meeting with Runa, but in reality to report everything to Kangwoo. On the other hand, Nina had repeatedly submitted her resignation to So, that wanting to leave the dance troupe, but all were rejected by So. So hoped that Nina could continue to perform ballet, able to take on the position of team leader in the future. So silently decided in her heart to take responsibility for her own fate, calmly accept death, and not let Dan die because of saving her. On the day they got married, the senior angel finally gave up his obsession and sent his blessings to both of them. This made Dan very grateful that the senior angel understood him. The wedding was attended only by the butler and the pet dog. Yonsei wore a wedding dress and holding a mustard bouquet, walked down the white carpet hand in hand with the one she loved. After reading their vows, then the two exchanged a kiss. After the wedding, every time they looked at each other, it was with deep and profound gazes, living each second like a year. That day after Dan went out, So also went to the church. She held the angel's handkerchief and told God that she was willing to give up everything for the one she loved. However, right at the place where So was praying, Dan had also spoken to God. He was also willing to commit any crime for the one he loved. Dan then went to an abandoned building where Runa was waiting for him. Just as Dan had sworn before God, he was willing to commit a crime for So, even to KL. Dan walked towards Runa, and when Dan was about to kill Runa, that a henchman stabbed in his abdomen and made him injured. At this moment, the senior angel appeared at the scene, making every effort to stop Dan one last time. But Dan was not swayed, as if his life was destined to identify for So. That was his greatest wish. At this moment, the henchman raised his knife and charged at Dan. Suddenly, the senior angel dealt with the henchman with just a snap of his fingers. Dan looked at the senior angel in disbelief, not expecting that the angel who had always prevented Dan would commit a crime to fulfill his wish. After killing the henchman, the senior angel knelt on the ground, waiting for God's punishment. Soon a cloud of black smoke appeared, wrapping around the senior angel's body. He frankly told Dan that he was deeply influenced by Dan's humanity, gradually understanding the entanglement of love and hatred in the world. He could only express his support for Dan in this way. Before turning to dust, the senior angel used his divine power to do one last thing for Dan, which was to teleport him to the church. At this moment, So was in the church, pouring out a pile of sleeping pills intending to end her life. Dan saw this and angrily knocked the pills down. The two faced each other, finally expressing their intentions to sacrifice for each other. But after the argument, Dan, who was injured, that fell into So's embrace, using all his strength to tell her not to die, but to live well. After saying this, he fell into a coma. After So took Dan to the hospital, Kangwoo also arrived. He told So that Dan seemed to be injured because he wanted to kill Runa. So realized that Dan had set aside his own death and could not help but sigh. Kangwoo also sharply pointed out that while they appeared to be paying the price for each other, in reality, reality, they were both selfish because they were both afraid of being left alone in the world. Yeon-seo felt very aggrieved by the criticism. She no longer spoke to Kang-woo, only leaving a message that she would not perform ballet anymore, because the next 3 days were the last days of Dan's life in this world. She had to protect him every step of the way. After Dan was discharged from the hospital, he took Yeon-seo to the church to pay their respects to the senior angel who had turned to dust because of them. On the senior angel's desk, Dan saw a report. It turned out before he decided to die, he had still prayed to God to give Dan and Yeon-seo a chance to be together. After the subordinate died, that Runa's hatred grew even stronger. She wanted to take revenge on Dan. At this point, Nina and the police teamed up to set a trap, tricking Runa into being caught by the police on the spot. And then the police found many pieces of evidence in the subordinate's phone that implicated Runa, enough to convict her. With Runa's arrest, Yeon-seo's safety seemed no longer threatened. Under the persuasion of Kang-woo and Dan, Yeon-seo finally agreed to continue participating in the performance. The public performance 3 days later was also the day Dan would disappear. In the morning, Dan and Yeon-seo held hands and left the house, with no sadness on their faces. They had prepared for this farewell for a long time and had shed countless tears over it. Now they should face it with a smile. At this time, a disturbance occurred at the detention center. Runa was still unrepentant and pretended to depart from life by herself, was taken to the hospital by the police. She assaulted a nurse in the hospital, and after changing clothes, she went to the dance troupe's building. Runa intentionally revealed her location to Nina, telling her that her target was not Yeon-seo, but rather to kill Dan. Runa knew that Nina, with her kindness, would definitely inform Dan, luring him out of the performance hall. Indeed, after Dan received the news, he immediately went to find Runa in the building, just as the first performance of the program ended. During the break, Yeon-seo stepped out of the performance room and accidentally saw a girl with a weapon following Dan. After Dan looked around the building, he finally located Runa. He chased her, but Runa suddenly turned around and threw the weapon on the ground, saying that this was an opportunity for Dan to kill her. Dan struggled internally, but ultimately did not act and let the police take Runa away. When Runa was taken away, she told Dan, "Death should have belonged to you," which made Dan increasingly fearful, wondering if Runa's reluctance to kill him meant she had already killed someone else. At that moment in the stage dressing room, Yeon-seo entered with a pale face, and she hurriedly asked Nina if she would take on the lead role the next day. After speaking, Yeon-seo went up on stage. On stage was the scene of the female lead pretending to be dead, but in reality, death was occurring to Yeon-seo. After she discovered that Runa was holding a weapon, Yeon-seo attempted to stop Runa, but Runa stabbed in her stomach. The blood on Yeon-seo's stomach became increasingly vivid on stage, but she had promised Dan that she would give him the most perfect performance. By the time the performance ended, Yeon-seo collapsed into Dan's arms after stepping off the stage. Everyone rushed Yeon-seo to the hospital for emergency treatment. Dan watched the countdown clock as it approached midnight, ticking down the seconds. He knelt outside the operating room, hoping that he could turn to dust as he wished, because it meant Yeon-seo might survive. Suddenly his body began to become transparent, and Dan smiled before turning into a wisp of green smoke. Although Yeon-seo escaped the Grim Reaper's scythe, she remained in a state of unconsciousness, with vital signs not looking promising, at risk of dying at any moment. Meanwhile, Runa, when being in the detention center, was not thinking about Yeon-seo's severe injuries, but rather whether Nina would replace her as the lead role. After confirming the news from the police, Runa revealed a joyful expression. All her planning had not been in vain. Now Nina could finally obtain the position of her dreams. But the very next second, the police played a news video, revealing that Nina had announced her retirement immediately after the performance. She took responsibility for what her family had done and would never stand on stage again. Upon learning of this outcome, Runa collapsed. Days passed, but Yeon-seo still did not wake up. The housekeeper cried to Kang-woo by the hospital bed. Yeon-seo's condition was not promising, and even Dan had disappeared. At this moment, Kang-woo noticed Dan's handkerchief, but strangely that the feather pattern on it had not turned black. Dan should have turned to dust, and the feather on the handkerchief should have turned black. It turns out that after Dan disappeared, he returned to heaven. God issued a divine decree, stating that it was because the senior angel had persistently pleaded for mercy, and because Dan had resisted the temptation to kill, that God was willing to forgive Dan's sins and allow him to ascend to heaven once more. Dan became an angel again and returned to the human world, but now his body was angelic, and humans could not see him. In order to meet Yeon-seo, he entered Yeon-seo's dream. In the dream, Dan brought Yeon-seo home from the hospital. The two of them lived a happy married life, but in one night, while Yeon-seo was lying in Dan's arms, she suddenly asked whether she was in an illusion now, because Yeon-seo couldn't feel Dan's heartbeat. Seeing that Yeon-seo had discovered the truth, Dan did not deny it. He caressed Yeon-seo's face, saying that meeting her and and loving her were the greatest gifts this world had given him. Finally, he kissed Yeonso's lips one last time. At the same time, in reality, Dan stood by the hospital bed and kissed Yeonso. When a tear fell on Yeonso's face, the feather on the handkerchief instantly burned black. Dan sacrificed his life again to exchange for Yeonso's recovery. A few months later, Yeonso recovered and returned to lead the company. She was a leader, showing no mercy to make her uncle and aunt, and Runa pay for the crimes they deserved. As for reorganizing the company, Yeonso was very forgiving, but on a personal level, Yeonso could never escape Dan's shadow. She often felt that Dan was still by her side, so she would talk to the air and go to the bench where they first met on rainy days, waiting for Dan to appear under the rain. The housekeeper couldn't bear seeing Yeonso being trapped in love, so she finally took the opportunity to invite Yeonso for a drink, brought out a box found in Dan's room, and placed it on the table, angrily saying that Dan had actually intended to leave Yeonso. It turned out that the box was filled with anniversary cards. Dan had been writing them from the first week of their marriage up until their 10th anniversary. After reading the cards, Yeonso burst into tears. She collapsed into the housekeeper's arms, saying that she still didn't want to forget Dan. In fact, Dan had always been by Yeonso's side, only this time, humans couldn't see him. After the performance, Kangwoo decided to leave the dance troupe and go abroad. Before leaving, he met with Nina. Nina parted with the stage and became a dance teacher. She felt that this was the life that suited her. That day, Yeonso once again went to the bench where the two of them first met. Dan quietly sat down beside her, listening to Yeonso talk to herself. Just as he was about to wipe away Yeonso's tears, Yeonso suddenly turned her head and saw Dan beside her. At that moment, Dan appeared before her, as if he were a real existence. Yeonso carefully reached out her hand, touched the spot where Dan's heart was, and indeed, there was warmth and a heartbeat. Yeonso joyfully embraced him. At that moment, the angelic silk scarf on Dan's chest suddenly disappeared. It turned out that yesterday, Dan had written his final report to God. He had understood the purpose of the mission that God entrusted to him, which was to observe humanity from now on. Dan would accompany Yeonso as a human, fulfilling the lifelong mission of observation. He would follow God's will, enjoy this miraculous love, and live happily with Yeonso. The movie ends here. If you enjoyed it, please give a like to motivate us to create more great videos.